It's well after midnight, somewhere deep in the dungeon, and the players have chosen a room they already cleared out to hole up for the night and rest. Many of them are wounded, they used up many spells, they need to rest, they need to spend the night in the dungeon. Fearful of the creatures that lurk outside, they set up 2 watches. 2 hours into the second watch, Keck, the dwarven war priest with the high wisdom and therefore high perception, hears something. Something outside the door. He gestures to Nicodemus, the half-orc fighter, now Count Nicodemus of Rend. Nicodemus looks from Keck to the door. Nicodemus hasn't heard anything, but he watches as Keck picks up his maul and prepares for battle. Nicodemus slowly and quietly stands up, preparing his great 2-handed war axe, Wound. Keck presses his ear to the door and listens. "There is something without," he says. Nicodemus hisses, "Keep your voice down, what do you hear?" On the other side of the door, they hear a sound, something sniffing. They hear heavy footprints. There's something just on the other side of the door that can smell them, that is sniffing them out. Keck, wielding the 2-handed maul of Xerok the Lawgiver, looks at Nicodemus and says, "We should attack. We should use the element of surprise." Nicodemus looks down at the dwarf and says, "Are you crazy? Wait." Keck restrains himself. They both listen at the door and they hear the sniffing sound. Move on. Whatever was on the other side of the door, whatever was looking for them, didn't find them. And the night passes uneventfully. That's because I asked the players to make 2 rolls for random encounters. I use a D12, I'll explain why later, and I say if you roll an 11 or a 12, there's a random encounter, and the players rolled a 6 for the first watch, and a 10 for the next watch. So I just role-played the process of something in the dungeon. The players don't know what, on patrol, looking for them, sniffing for them. But in this case, whatever was on the other side of the door, whatever's looking for them, didn't find them. Hey everybody, Matt Colville here. We're going to talk about some proper Dungeon Master advice. This episode is about random encounters. We're also going to do a giveaway at the end of the episode tied to a certain number of subscribers, so stay tuned. It's related to the map building stuff we've been doing on Twitch. I hope you've had a chance to check it out. If not, don't worry, I'm probably going to make a video at the end summarizing the whole thing. I didn't always use random encounters in my game. In fact, I know some DMs never use them. I think it's purely down to your style of play, and as a Dungeon Master, my style of play changes almost with every campaign I run. The game I'm currently running at Turtle Rock Studios is kind of a throwback to the old school way of running D&D, where just getting from point A to point B is dangerous, and that's where the idea of random encounters comes from. So under no circumstance should you feel as though random encounters are something that you should use or have to use. It is a tool in your toolbox, and I really think it's down to your style of play. It's something that either you do often in this campaign because you're going for a certain feel, or it's something you hardly ever do because your game is more narrative focused, it's more story driven. We inherit the idea of random encounters from a game that existed before Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, if you went and bought the 3 little brown booklets, the original version of D&D that was published in 1974, it explicitly told you that in order to play D&D, you needed this other game. Actually, you needed 2 other games. You needed Chainmail in order to handle combat, and then you needed something from another company entirely. This was not a game that TSR made. It was a game that they all owned and used from a company called Avalon Hill. It was called Outdoor Survival. There's a picture of it over here. It was one of their bookcase game series, not entirely unlike Merchant of Venus, which is a game I love. I have lots of Avalon Hill bookcase games. Avalon Hill's Outdoor Survival was its own self-contained game, and it was a game that all the folks who ran and played Dungeons & Dragons back in 1974 all owned, so it was an easy thing for them to just use it to deal with overland movement. You can see the Outdoor Survival map here. It was always the same map, and the idea was that depending on the scenario, you would start in 1 hex, and your goal was to get, remember hexes, we're back to hexes, you would start in 1 hex and try to get to another hex, and the farther away they were, the harder it was to do, and you would have to roll on these various charts to see what happened as you tried to go over these mountains or go through this forest. And just getting from point A to point B was the entire game of Outdoor Survival. The game they were playing was called Dungeons & Dragons. The idea was that the game master designed a dungeon. The rules explicitly tell the dungeon master you need to come up with 6 levels of dungeon before you start your first game. The idea of playing in a city or playing in the wilderness or having an entire adventure just take place in the town did not occur to these guys when they first started. The fun, the juice of the game was exploring dungeons. And each game master had his own dungeon. We don't really play that way anymore, but when you went from the dungeon back to town, you would use this other game. You would use Outdoor Survival to determine what happened when you got from the dungeon back to town. Just getting the loot, the treasure that you got from the dungeon back to your town so you could spend it, so you could use it, was a big deal. It was considered an accomplishment. That should explain a lot of how random encounters in overland movement work, and it also kind of explains some of the monsters in D&D. There are lots of monsters in Dungeons & Dragons that you would probably never encounter if you never used overland movement random encounters. In fact, there used to be a stat. Monsters had a stat in the monster manual, in the original monster manual, and the stat was % chance in lair. The idea being, if you encountered this monster as a result of an overland movement random encounter, what are the odds that you came across it while it was in its lair? You know, it's a very different experience to fight a black dragon, for instance, on the wing, so to speak. It sees the player's camp as it flies over hunting during the night. That's one experience. There, the dragon kind of has the advantage. It can swoop down, it can breathe acid on you, and it can fly away when it's wounded. But fighting a black dragon in its lair is a very different experience. For one thing, that's where its treasure is. If you kill the black dragon because it attacked you while you were making camp in the middle of the forest, then you probably didn't get any treasure as a result. But if you fight it while it's in its lair, then you will get treasure. But the flip side of that is the black dragon can't really retreat. This is its lair. There's nowhere for it to retreat to. So if you fight a black dragon out in the forest, out in the wilderness, in the middle of the night, if things get too hairy for the heroes, or if the black dragon gets too wounded, the dragon can fly away. Not so in the lair. So you get a sense of how built into the bones of Dungeons & Dragons random encounters are. Nowadays, I think a lot of games are more narrative and story focused, and so the idea of exploring, of just getting from point A to point B being dangerous, I don't think we use that. I think it's somewhat unfashionable. It is mentioned in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and there are other uses for it besides just making overland movement difficult. Random encounters are also incredibly useful in the dungeon. In fact, I think they are probably used in the dungeon these days more than for overland movement. I think in this day and age, if you're just trying to get from point A to point B, the only stuff that will happen to you is stuff that the Dungeon Master has already cooked up, like somebody ambushes you, like maybe bandits ambush you. It depends on the adventure you're running. Even dungeon crawls, I think, in this day and age are somewhat out of fashion. I still use them. I love dungeon crawls. I probably always will. But a lot of adventures these days are more narrative and story focused. So the bad guys that you're fighting aren't all, collected in some underground complex. So it tells you a lot about me as a dungeon master that I am running a game that not only features dungeons, like proper underground complexes, but also making overland movement dangerous. I am deliberately running a game that is a kind of throwback to the games they ran in the 70s and the 80s because I have a kind of nostalgia for that. Even though I only started playing in the mid to late 80s, I have this crazy nostalgia for an era that I didn't belong to. We need a word for that in English. Nostalgia for an era that you weren't a part of. So you may find that, like wilderness survival, dungeons aren't to your taste, which is fine. But if you do use dungeons, if you do have players exploring these underground complexes or castles or whatever, where there are several combat encounters in a row and there's no way for the players to do it all in one day, then it may be useful for you to use random encounters. Because ultimately, the idea of exploring this underground complex, of dealing with all these monsters that are all grouped together, is a question of resource management. Players are, of course, risk averse. They want to risk as little as possible. So if you give them the chance, they will rest. They'll take a long rest after every encounter. I mean, why not? Realistically speaking, if you had to fight a bunch of orcs in order to survive, just one encounter with orcs would probably wipe you out, and you would say, you know what, let's stop and rest until we are fully healthy and have all our spells back. So random encounters in the dungeon are a way to counter that desire. It is a perfectly natural desire. There is nothing wrong with the players deciding that they want to spend the night after the first encounter, but you want to discourage that because it robs the adventure of tension. And that's the whole point of doing this, is drama, right? Tension and resolution. Random encounters also reinforce the idea that the world is a dangerous place, that the dungeon is dangerous to explore, and that the wilderness is dangerous to explore. Of course, this has to scale by level. A 9th level party probably no longer worries about getting ambushed by goblins in the middle of the forest. In fact, a 9th level party probably has lots of ways of getting from point A to point B that do not involve walking there. So to a certain extent, the idea of overland movement causing random encounters is based on the heroes being somewhat low level. So let's talk about how I do it. Let's talk about how I run random encounters. And of course, if you've watched my videos, you should know that I am not saying this is the right way to do it. It's not even the only way I have done it. It's just the way I'm doing it right now. Typically, the players start in town and they have some rumor, some word, someone they've met that has told them about some place out in the wilderness that is relevant to their interests. Like there's a goblin mine in the swamp, or like there's a ruined keep in the forest. And the players can count the number of hexes between where they're starting and where they're trying to get to. And again, we're back to hexes, right? Now you're starting to understand why I like them. They provide a nice little unit of measurement. The players count the number of hexes, and I have them make one roll for every wilderness hex they move through. Now that means if they're going a long way away, if they're going 10 hexes 240 miles away, they're going to be making 10 rolls, which is why I tend to have all the wilderness stuff near where the players are. So let's imagine that the place they're trying to get to is 5 hexes away from the town they're starting in. That means they have to make 5 rolls. That's 5 chances for them to have a random encounter. There are lots of ways to determine whether or not there is a random encounter in the woods, and in fact, I've played games where it was modified by whether or not there was a ranger in the party. Rangers made it less likely that there would be a random encounter, and in fact, I also think that in the player's handbook, actual rangers in 5th edition are impossible to surprise in their favored terrain, which is fantastic. It actually at one point resulted in the players making different decisions when they traveled, which I think is neat. They went through the forest instead of taking the road because they had a ranger with them whose favored terrain was forest, and they were told that the road was dangerous, that there were bandits on the road. And in fact, if they had taken the road, they would have been ambushed by bandits, but they listened to the ranger who said we should go through the forest, and as a result, there was no encounter. But typically what I do is for every hex they're moving through in the wilderness, this doesn't count typically on roads or in civilization, every hex they're moving through in the wilderness, I have them roll a 12-sided die because I just like 12-sided dice and I don't think they get used that much. They used to use a 6-sided die back in the 70s, and I think if you got a 6, there was a random encounter. So if they're moving through 5 wilderness hexes, I tell the players to roll 5 times and they get a random encounter if they get an 11 or 12. Why 11 or 12 on a 12-sided die? I don't know. I just made it up. I think it's because it harkens back to that old school D6 way of doing things. And I tell the players, if you roll an 11, you're going to be on one chart, but if you roll a 12, then you get a harder encounter, right? Rolling higher on the 12-sided die, rolling a 12 is more dangerous. So I imply that there are 2 charts for each type of terrain. There is the easy chart and the difficult chart, and it depends what they roll, what chart they get. And of course, there's a 10 and 12 or a 5 and 6 chance that nothing happens. Now, if you know me, if you've been paying attention, you may have guessed I have no charts. That notion, the thing I lie to my players. I literally say that there's a different chart for an 11 versus a 12, but there are no charts. I just want them to feel like these things are objective, that these are the rules of the world, that this isn't just something Matt has made up. So I lie and I say that if they roll an 11, they get the easy chart. If they roll a 12, they get the difficult chart. And a 1 through 10, nothing happens. But the trick here is if they get an encounter, once they get an encounter, then that's it. We deal with the encounter and they don't have to roll anymore. The goal of the random encounter during Overland movement is just to make the world feel dangerous. It's not to maximize how many bad guys they fight. So once they get a random encounter, we resolve it, and then I take it easy on them and I say, okay, you managed to reach your destination. The funny thing though is even though I made up the idea that there are 2 different charts, a hard one if they roll a 12 and an easy one if they roll an 11, there actually is a tool online, which we'll look at in a minute, that has easy, moderate, and difficult charts that you can roll on, and now I use that. So first I made it up, and then I discovered that there was a tool online that made my nonsense seem real. That's the great thing about running D&D in this day and age is whatever problem you're trying to solve, other people, lots of other people have tried to solve this problem, and someone has probably created a tool to make it easy. Now I say there are 2 charts, one easy and one difficult, but even the easy chart is somewhat nasty. The idea being that a random encounter that happens in the wilderness should be challenging. It needs to be challenging, otherwise it's a waste of time because the players will quickly learn, they will conclude rightly, that this is the only thing they're going to do that day. When you're traveling through the wilderness, days pass and nothing happens. So if they encounter a bad guy out here in the middle of the forest, the players know this is probably the only bad guy we're going to encounter. Let's use all our resources. Let's cast all our spells. Let's use our wild shape. Let's do everything. Now, I have the players roll once per hex, but I have in the past, and I've played with other DMs that have them roll once, period, and modify the roll by the number of hexes. So maybe if you move far enough, you guarantee the idea that you're going to get an encounter. That's down to taste. It makes perfect sense to me, the idea that you're going to roll 1 die. It's less die rolling, right? But I think players like rolling dice. That's one of the reasons I have the players roll for the random encounters. I could do it behind the screen, and a lot of DMs do, but I like the idea that their fate is in their hands. So I tell the players to roll. If they're traveling through many hexes, then that might mean a lot of rolls. And maybe for you, it makes more sense if they only make 1 roll and then modify it by the number of hexes they're moving through, or the number of miles they travel if you don't like hexes. And in that case, I probably wouldn't use a D12. I would probably use percentile dice, because I would still want it to be possible for nothing to happen. So you might say there is a 25% chance of you guys getting a random encounter. Maybe it's down to terrain. Maybe it's 20% in the forest, 25% in the mountains, and then modify it by 1% or 3% for every hex they move through. That would make it unlikely that you'd ever end up in a situation where you would be guaranteed to get a random encounter, because that would make it not very random. But of course, random encounters are also random because A, you don't know if one is going to happen, and then B, you don't know what you're going to fight. So there are lots of charts online, and there's a tool we'll look at in a minute for generating a random encounter, but I have often pretended to roll on a chart behind the screen, but really I'm just looking through the monster manual to see what's cool. And my idea of what is fun to use in a random encounter is affected by the fact that some of the monsters in the monster manual you're probably never going to encounter unless you have random encounters out in the wilderness. Like the players were trying to get from point A to point B in my Thursday night game, they had a random encounter and I decided to use a wyvern. Now, of course, I told them I rolled randomly, but I didn't. I just thought, oh, wyverns are cool. When was the last time I used one? I may never use one. Let's use one tonight. And it was a lot of fun, actually. It was the first time the players had any kind of random encounter out in the wilderness, and they learned a lot. For instance, when they decided to make camp that night, they found out that Sai, the Elven Ranger, he's an elf. He doesn't need to sleep. He just meditates. And they were like, well, does that mean we don't need to take watch? And they're like, yeah, I don't think that means, I think that the elf can basically watch for us, because half the night he doesn't need to sleep, and the other half he's just sitting there meditating. So let's all just go to bed. Which meant when the wyvern attacked, only Sai was awake. He was the only one in his armor. Everyone else was asleep and unarmored, and that's when they found out it takes like 10 minutes to put your armor on. I didn't give them any advice in this regard. I let them play the way they wanted to. They were very low-level characters, and this was how they learned to set watch, because once you've set watches, you have characters that begin battle in their armor. Super useful. I had a lot of fun with that encounter, watching the players scramble around, trying to deal with the fact that only one of them had any armor on. And a wyvern is an incredibly nasty thing to throw up against a low-level party, but I reasoned thusly wise. Yes, it is a powerful bad guy, and it may indeed very badly wound one of the heroes. I made sure it didn't kill anybody, but once the heroes had done enough damage to it, I had it fly away. Because it's a wild animal, it's out looking for food, it sees some defenseless humans, it decides to try to eat them. Once they put up enough of a fight, I have it leave. So this is one of the kind of interesting side effects of using a high-level monster as part of a random encounter. If it attacks the heroes while they've made camp and are just spending the night, then once it's taken enough damage, it's going to run away. I still award full experience in a situation like that because the players dealt with the random encounter. But if the players come across the monster in its lair while they're traveling from point A to point B, then the players have all the power. The players are in a position to opt in to decide whether or not to go after this monster. It's a very tough monster because that's the nature of a random encounter, but it's with its treasure, it's in its lair. The players get a greater reward if they beat it. And because the players have come upon the monster in its lair, they have the advantage. They have the opportunity to get all the information they want, and they have the element of surprise. It's time to put on your makeup.
And they're missing a huge opportunity here, because we all know one of the main elements of attack is the element of surprise. So what could be more surprising than the 1st Battalion Transvestite Brigade?
So that's how I handle encounters in Overland movement. The players in my campaign, in one group they're 4th level, in another group they're 6th level, and I think the 6th level party is basically done with random encounters in the Overland. They have their own method for getting from point A to point B. That means they don't have to go through the forest, they don't have to roll dice for every hex, and they're now high enough level that other stuff is going to start trying to avoid them. This process of the players kind of outgrowing random encounters also helps them feel like they've accomplished something, like they've grown and developed as heroes. The kind of stuff that used to really challenge them when they were 1st, 2nd, and 3rd level now doesn't even happen anymore. It's another thing that happens when you play D&D for a while and you get a high-level character. You start missing that earlier kind of play where, being low-level, you worried about just getting from point A to point B. On the one hand, it's an accomplishment when you don't have to worry about it anymore. On the other hand, it's a fun sense of accomplishment when you actually do it, when you actually make it from point A to point B and deal with the random encounter. Using these creatures like wyverns and will-o'-the-wisps in their native environment in the wilderness makes the world feel richer and more plausible, because the types of creatures the players encounter are widened. Not only are there creatures down here where this is their native environment and you're just moving through their home and that's why they're attacking you, they're hungry and they're looking for food, the game also includes guys up here, crazy things like beholders and mind flayers. A game that has a wide variety of different bad guys to fight in different environments, I think, is a game that feels more plausible and more grounded. Which is, again, down to your style of play. In the dungeon, or whatever kind of underground complex they're dealing with, or above ground, it could be a castle or a temple, but anytime the players are trying to clear out a lot of rooms that are full of bad guys, a place that has multiple levels, the players are going to very quickly decide that they want to rest because they want to minimize risk. Now, this is a very different experience than the Overland movement thing, where they're just trying to get from point A to point B. Here, they're in a dungeon, they're fighting for their lives, they're questing after some bad guy they're trying to stop, or some treasure they're trying to acquire. And especially if you have new players, after the first encounter, they might say, whoa, I just took a lot of damage, or I'm out of spells, let's stop. Not let's rest for an hour, let's spend the night. And if they do that, then it kind of removes the tension from the game, so it's your job as the dungeon master to put the tension back in. And that's one of the things random encounters are great for, and I think sometimes just the threat of a random encounter is enough to keep the players going. But again, you want the random encounters in the dungeon to be nastier than the normal things they would be dealing with. Otherwise, they'll just opt for the random encounter. If the random encounters are skeletons, but the stuff they're fighting in the dungeon is ghouls and wights, then of course the players will stop and rest because they'd rather fight skeletons in the random encounter than ghouls and wights while they explore. So that's another piece of advice. Whatever you're dealing with in the adventure, the random encounter should be nastier because it disincentivizes the players from stopping. And the way I do it is, if they take a short rest, they roll once. If they they take a long rest, they roll twice, once for each watch. Now, that doesn't make any literal sense, and my players always say, wait a minute, if it's one check for a short rest and a short rest is an hour, shouldn't that mean 8 checks for a long rest, because a long rest is 8 hours? And indeed, you could do that if you want, but I think 8 checks is pretty unforgiving. So I say, no, it's once per watch. As Dungeon Masters, it's up to us to control the pacing of the game. Just because it's 1 check for 1 hour during a short rest doesn't mean it's 8 checks for a long rest that's 8 hours. That would be pretty tedious, and that's why I like tying it to watches. I say there are 2 watches, who's on first watch, who's on second watch.
Third base!
And I have each watch roll. Random encounters in the dungeon also incentivize the players to look at the dungeon more like a battlefield, more like this is a thing they are exploring, this is a thing they're moving through. When they clear out one room, they think to themselves, this is a easily defensible place. We should remember this for when we have to sleep. We'll come back here and we'll bar the door. Or one of the things that players ask about is on the list of things they can buy are pitons. They're like, what are these things? I'm like, well, they're those little metal spikes that you can hammer into a rock cliff face if you need to climb, but they're also easily used as spikes that you hammer under the door, between the gap between the door and the floor, to hammer a door shut. If the bad guys find them in the middle of the night, the fact that the door has been spiked shut means the players are going to get a couple of rounds where they can get ready, prepare spells, wake their sleeping allies up, put on their armor before the bad guys inevitably burst through the door. And there's a lot of tension there as the bad guys start attacking the door, and the heroes can see the door is starting to break and splinter under the assault. Now, of course, if your players have had a long adventuring day and you feel as though a random encounter is too nasty for them, then you roll behind the screen. Don't have them roll, and take it easy on them. Roll a 1 or a 2, or just, roll a d4 and ignore it. Random encounters are purely a tool that you can use to make the world feel more dangerous, more threatening, which in some ways makes it feel more plausible, and control the pacing of the adventure, the pacing of the game, and kind of disincentivize your players from playing in the most risk-averse way possible. I found a great tool for generating random encounters that I have actually used in the middle of my campaign. I just looked for it randomly online and found it, and I really liked it. There's a link to it in the doobly-doo. You may have found your own random encounter resources online, or you made your own, in which case, please link to them in the comments. The more the merrier. Let's take a look at how this random encounter generator works and how I use it. Okay, this is the tool that I found to use online for generating random encounters. I feel it's pretty straightforward, easy to use, and I told my players when they roll an 11, they get the easy chart, and when they roll a 12, they roll the hard chart. So I use hard or deadly here in this tool. Let's pick hard. And let's imagine that we were using this for the Thursday night group, which is 6 4th level players. So I'm just going to go level 4, add player that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they are moving through, let's imagine they're moving through the hills. It's going to do its best to try to pick monsters based on the environment that I've chosen. Minimum number of monster and chance of, we can do single types. So they fight one type of something like lots of bugbears, or mixed types. I think mixed types is cool. I own the monster manual. I don't just own the basic rules, so we choose the monster manual. You can pick a seed monster and it will do its best to say, well, an adult black dragon and what else? What hangs out with an adult black dragon? But here I'll say no seed monsters. 15 seems like a lot. So let's reduce the max number of monsters to 6 and generate a random encounter and see what we get for 6 4th level heroes out in the hills. Right? Ooh, they fight a stone golem. Okay, that is super cool. But I don't know what a stone golem is doing. I mean, a golem out in the middle of the... But that question, why is there a golem? A golem is an automaton. It's a construct. It only follows orders. It must have a master. Golem must have a master. So there's probably a wizard or something, or maybe the golem has escaped from some dungeon that's nearby. And that to me is super cool. Although you could just take this. Remember, there's no virtue in using the output of this as is. It's not like this tool has any great insight. If you look at Stone Golem and go, no, that's too crazy. What about a Stone Giant, right? Stone Giant and Stone Golem don't have anything in common, but the one reminded you of the other and you felt like the Stone Giant was cool, so why not use it? Let's see what I get if I generate another encounter. Cool, a bunch of orcs. There are 2 orc eyes of Grumsh. There's an Orog, which is a kind of orc, 2 of them, and there's 1 regular orc. And you might change it up. You might say, no, I think there's 3 orcs, 1 Orog, and 1 eye of Grumsh. There's no reason to exactly use the numbers they've given you. This is just a tool to inspire you. Let's see what happens. I mean, these are pretty cool encounters, actually. I like these. 4 berserkers. What is a berserker? I think it's in the appendix to the monster manual. What else might we get? 4 griffins. I think a bunch of griffins, like a patrol, like a flock of griffins would be a great idea for a random encounter. Let's change it to underground. Right, so now we're in a dungeon, and let's click deadly. The players rolled a 12 on their 12-sided die. What do they get? This is going to be crazy. Let's see what we get. 2 cyclopses. That reminds me of my favorite joke, which is from Yellow Submarine.
Hey, there's a cyclops.
Can't be, he's got 2 eyes.
Well, must be a bicyclops.
It's a bicyclops. I love that. So 2 Cyclopses in a dungeon, that sort of makes sense. Although I might just go, Cyclopses are things I expect to find in the hills or the mountains. Let's try again. Ooh, 3 black puddings. Let me tell you, 1 black pudding is enough. 3 black puddings is crazy, but it's up to you how many black puddings to use. Black pudding is definitely something I would expect to find in a dungeon, and it makes a great random encounter because it can get under the door. So because it's an ooze, it's just a fungus on the ground. So the players, even if they've spiked the door shut, the black pudding can still attack them. I love that idea. Let's see, what else might we get? Ooh, a bunch of orcs and a manticore. They keep these orcs, and their war chief keep this manticore as a pet. Again, why are there orcs in the dungeon? Is it an orcish dungeon? Maybe. If not, if I feel as though I don't know that there were orcs down here, I just click generate encounter again, and I get a vampire. That is a deadly encounter. That is definitely a deadly encounter. What is a vampire doing down here? Well, one of the things, now I might just dismiss that, or I might actually use it, because one of the things I like about old school adventures is that, for instance, I believe in Against the Cult of the Reptile God, the bad guy, Explicitica Defilis, is in her lair. She's asleep on a pile of coins, but you might encounter her elsewhere in the dungeon. She doesn't just stay in one place. She goes on patrol. She visits her minions. She gives them orders, right? She needs food. So you might encounter the bad guy of this adventure not in his lair, not in the final room, not in the last room of the adventure. And it might give the players an opportunity to encounter this bad guy, fight them, and then the bad guy retreats, or the players retreat, and now they have some information about who the bad guy is and how the bad guy operates. I think that stuff is cool. Let's do one more. I love random encounters. This is fun. This tool is neat. It is fun to use, and it is also a great opportunity to be inspired as a dungeon master. You don't have to use a vampire. You could use a gynosphinx or a gynosphinx. It's a girl sphinx, androsphinx and gynosphinx. And I think that, what is one of these things doing wandering around? They used to call them wandering monsters. I don't know. Let's see what else. A flame skull, 3 flame skulls. That sounds cool. A bunch of undead patrolling. I think that's a cool idea, especially in a dungeon. The idea that there's a bunch of undead patrolling around. So that's the random encounter episode. I'll put a link to the tool in the doobly-doo. It's up to you whether or not you use random encounters and how you use them. And I hope you can see that I use them I have a system, but my system is kind of ad hoc. Thanks for watching. I hope that was useful. I think random encounters are a great tool for new DMs to use. We've been doing a lot of world building in Twitch on the weekends on Sunday at 11 o'clock. We'll do another stream this coming up Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. For this world building we've been doing in Twitch, I've been using Hexographer, which I really like. I enjoy using Hexographer because I like those old school kind of maps. I've done maps by hand. I've done maps in Campaign Cartographer, but for this campaign, for this setting that I'm running right now, I like that old school feel. And Hexographer is a lot of fun to use. It can generate like a random world, and it does its best to kind of figure out where mountain ranges would go and where forests should be. It's not literally just random terrain everywhere. So in the spirit of the Twitch Building a World stream, and because I like the software, and because I actually like contests and giving stuff away, I am going to give away a free copy. You'll get serial numbers for every product that company, Inkwell Ideas, makes. They make Hexographer, they make Dungeonographer, which we talked about earlier, they make Cityographer, so you can make cities, and they have a great heraldry tool if you want to create your own heraldry. So we just hit 14,000 subscribers a couple days ago. Let's do the giveaway when we hit 17,000 subscribers. And it's going to work the way it worked when we gave away the Meteoric Iron D20, where everyone who comments below is entered to win. And once we hit 17,000 subscribers, I'm going to randomly draw someone. The winner gets a copy of Hexographer, Dungeonographer, and Cityographer, and their heraldry tool, so you can make coats of arms for your world. And that's about $100. Actually, the last giveaway was a die that was worth $200. So let's give away 2 copies of each of those pieces of software. We'll have 2 winners. I'll draw 2 names from the entries down below. Everybody who comments is entered. Once we hit 17,000 subscribers, I'll pick 2 people, and each of them will get 1 copy of each of those pieces of software. So the faster we get to 17,000 subscribers, the fewer comments there will be, and the more likely it is that you'll win. So feel free to share this channel, share this video, share some other video, share the alignment video, share the your first adventure video. It's up to you. I'm a big believer in social media. I love it. I'm on Twitter all the time. I'm on Reddit. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt Colville. I'm also Matt Colville on Twitch. That was the Random Encounters episode. I hope it was useful. As always, there are no ads on this channel. I don't have a Patreon. If you want to help support the channel, come by my Amazon page. There's a link in the doobly-doo. I'm an independent fantasy author. I have 2 novels out. I'm working on my 3rd novel. A lot of people have bought them, and some people seem to like them. There's not going to be a campaign diary this week, I don't think, because the 2 groups I have at Turtle Rock Studios, I am merging into 1 group because with the advent of this YouTube channel, I basically don't have time to run for 2 campaigns. So I'm going to run 1 campaign, and the good news for you is I am going to film our campaign. I'm going to record our games, and you're going to meet all the players, and I'm going to I'm not going to stream them. So you're not just going to be able to sit there and watch us play for 4 hours. Not yet. I think we'll probably get there. But in the first instance, I'm just going to put a camera on the players, a camera on on me, and I'm going to record the sessions, and then I'm going to cut them down and use them as B-roll for future videos. So we'll be able to actually talk about the meat and potatoes of running the game as I am doing it. Actual lessons from the table rather than some of this abstract theory stuff. But it's going to take me about a week, I think, to figure out how to bring the two groups together. We might play this week. Stay tuned. That's it for this episode. Next episode, I think, is going to be one for the players. I've talked about doing this before. I want to do a welcome to D&D episode that is just for new players, because I think there are a lot of unspoken, unwritten assumptions that reading the player's handbook or reading the basic rules will not explain, and a lot of things we take for granted, and I want to kind of pull the veil back and explain those things. Until next time, peace out.